RuneScape 3 is launching its first ever leagues later on this year, and I'd imagine that this is going to be bringing in a lot of old school RuneScape players back to RuneScape for the first time in years, possibly even ever, which is exactly why inside of this series, I've been breaking down each and every single region inside of RuneScape 3 and kind of comparing it to old school RuneScape. So, if in fact they do implement the region lock system inside of this league, we're all hopefully a little bit more prepared for which regions we want to select. Today, we're going to be diving into one of RuneScape's darkest regions, and that, of course, is Morytania. And let's just go ahead and get started here because in both old school RuneScape and RuneScape 3, you have your classic training methods such as Ecto for prayer or these farming patches right here. Really, RuneScape 3 is familiar in a lot of ways. However, it's also not so familiar in a lot of ways. Get it? That's mainly because Morytania is actually home to a couple of skills that are not even in old school RuneScape at all. That being summoning and archaeology. There are actually several spots throughout the game that you can train summoning and archaeology. However, it is worth pointing out that if they do end up doing the region lock system, you're going to want to know which regions you can actually train these skills in. And right here in Morytania, there is an obelisk where you can create summoning pouches and summoning scrolls, aka train summoning, but it's located smack dab in the middle of the Morytania swamp, which isn't ideal. But again, if it's the only spot that you have to train summoning, it's definitely going to work. However, this does kind of lead me into archaeology, which is another skill that has an area in which you can train right here in Morytania. But the skill itself is actually unlocked in Varrock, which thankfully we're all going to have access to. But the very first archaeology dig site that you gain access to is actually in the desert, meaning that you won't be able to train to a high enough level to even access the Morytania archaeology site unless you have access to the desert. Meaning that, again, if they do a region lock system, certain skills like this are going to play out really strange. Divination is another one, for example. However, divination is a lot more straightforward RuneScape skill, whereas in archaeology actually has a lot of complications to it with resources in order to restore artifacts, in order to complete mysteries, in order to unlock upgrades, all of which are happening in different places all throughout the game. So honestly, archaeology, this skill is probably the biggest argument as to why RuneScape 3 might not do a region lock system for this very first league. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, but let's go ahead and move on into the bosses inside of Morytania because there are actually a few key differences between RuneScape 3 and old school RuneScape. First off being the Barrows brothers. Now, we have both original versions of Barrows brothers in old school RuneScape and RuneScape 3. However, in RuneScape 3, there's also a secondary boss fight called the Rise of the Six. And this still revolves around the Six Brothers. However, it is an entirely different fight. And it's actually where you're going to be going to get yourself the tier 90 shields in each of the combat styles, which definitely makes it a spot that you want to keep in mind. I got a little bit of a bonus clip to throw in here. I found a bit of some interesting footage when I was digging up some B film for the Rise of the Six Barrows boss. We have Mod Kieran here from the old school RuneScape team years before he became a mod. Let's go ahead and roll the clips.
This update is that it's a really hard fight, but for a smaller team. You don't have to have a big team, which is, I found with previous bosses, it's been quite difficult to get people together sometimes. They like powered up, they just got destroyed and died pretty much straight away. Didn't have a chance.
But aside from the Barrows brothers, you also have Araxor and Araxi, which is the giant spider boss out here. Not exactly the same as old school RuneScape's boss fight. It's a little bit more complicated out here in RuneScape 3. However, this is where you're going to be getting yourself tier 90 weapons, such as the Noxious Scythe, which actually performs very similarly to the scythe that you get out of the Theater of Blood. Speaking of Theater of Blood, though, inside of RuneScape 3, there really is no elite boss or raid for you to take down inside of Morytania. And honestly, even when it comes to these smaller things, such as the Slayer Tower, old school RuneScape has that content much more fleshed out with things such as the gargoyle bosses. So it'll be interesting to see what people make of the Morytania region. And just because certain content isn't as fleshed out as it is in old school RuneScape, that doesn't mean that there's not things happening over here that aren't happening in old school RuneScape as well. For example, there are a couple of quest lines out here which can get you some pretty powerful weapons. You have the Blisterwood weapons coming out of the branches of Darkmire quest, and then you have the Sun Spear coming out of the River of Blood quest line. And this Sun Spear is actually a tier 78 weapon that acts as a hybrid weapon, meaning it can be melee, it can be range, or it can be mage. Especially because we're in an Iron Man league here, hybrid gear like this is definitely going to be something you want to keep your eyes on. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Was there any big things that I missed inside of Morytania here? I haven't played RuneScape 3 in a couple of years, actually. So it is entirely possible that I missed a few things here. So if you can think of anything, be sure to drop it down in the comments. Keep an eye out on the channel because I'm going to be breaking down a new region every single day this week. And you can check out the playlist to catch up on any of the regions that you might have missed. We're also going to be going live for RuneScape leagues, amongst other things. And these live streams are really going to kick back into the gear starting in May, happening over on Twitch and right here on YouTube. I'll have links down in the description, but that's all I wanted to break down today. I hope you guys all have an amazing day. I'm out.